I never imagined that a frozen morning would end with 42 families begging me to turn their heat back on. And if you told me that a few months earlier, I would have laughed in your face, because I'm not the kind of guy who enjoys making life miserable for other people. Honestly, I spend most of my days fixing electrical systems, drinking too much coffee, and trying to stay out of everybody else's business. But sometimes people keep pushing until they accidentally lean on the one thing they never should have touched. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 35 years old, born and raised just outside Duluth, Minnesota, and my family has owned the same 40-acre piece of land since my grandfather bought it after coming home from Korea. Back then, there wasn't a neighborhood. There weren't luxury homes. There wasn't an HOA. There were fields, pine trees, gravel roads, and a handful of hardworking families who all depended on each other because winters up here don't forgive mistakes. My grandfather used to say that in Minnesota, your neighbors don't have to like you, but they better be willing to help you when the snow starts falling, because Mother Nature doesn't care about your feelings. I grew up believing that, and maybe that's why what happened still bothers me more than I like to admit. After my divorce, I decided not to rush into building another house. I inherited the property after my dad passed away, parked my fifth-wheel RV near the old workshop, hooked everything up properly, and started saving money while drawing plans for a cabin I'd eventually build myself. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every utility was legal. Every permit was current. Every inch of that land belonged to me. Then the developers arrived. Within 6 years, the old farmland surrounding my property transformed into one of those picture-perfect subdivisions with oversized homes, heated driveways, decorative stone entrances, matching mailboxes, and an HOA that believed every blade of grass should ask permission before growing. My property sat right in the middle, like a stubborn reminder that the land had a history before they showed up, and I could tell from the beginning they hated looking at my RV. They never said it directly at first. Instead, they smiled during neighborhood gatherings, asked polite questions, complimented the trees, then quietly mailed violation notices even though I wasn't a member of their association. The president was a woman named Sharon Caldwell, probably around 60, always dressed like she was heading to a country club luncheon, even when she was walking through snow. Perfect hair, expensive boots, clipboard under one arm, fake smile that disappeared the second anyone challenged her. Every conversation with Sharon felt like talking to someone who had already decided she was right before you open your mouth. She loved saying things like, "We're simply protecting community standards," as if repeating those words enough somehow made them law. I ignored the letters for months because my attorney told me they had no authority over my property. But ignoring people like Sharon doesn't make them disappear. It usually encourages them. Then January arrived with one of the worst cold fronts we'd seen in years. Temperatures dropped so fast the weather station kept warning people to stay indoors because exposed skin could freeze within minutes. That Tuesday morning, I woke up feeling something was wrong before I even opened my eyes. The heater had stopped. The air inside the RV felt sharp enough to bite. My breath hung in front of my face. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped toward the electrical panel, only to realize the door wouldn't open all the way because someone had wrapped a chain around it from the outside. By the time I forced my way out through another door, I found the breaker box padlocked shut with a bright orange notice zip tied across it. Property violation. Unauthorized recreational vehicle visible during winter season. $750 fine. Remove structure within 14 days. At first, I honestly thought it had to be a prank, because nobody could possibly be stupid enough to cut power during negative 15-degree weather. Then I noticed the frozen water beneath the RV. One of the supply lines had already burst. I stood there staring at thousands of dollars in damage while my fingers went numb inside insulated gloves. And for the first time since moving there, I actually felt angry instead of annoyed. I called Sharon immediately. She answered on the second ring, sounding almost cheerful. I asked if she knew someone had locked my electrical panel. She didn't even pretend to be surprised. She calmly said, "Well, perhaps you'll finally understand that temporary housing isn't appropriate for a neighborhood of this quality." I remember standing there in the snow trying to process what I'd just heard because she wasn't denying it. She wasn't apologizing. She actually believed she was teaching me some kind of lesson. I told her she'd destroyed my plumbing. She replied, "Actions have consequences." Ethan, I laughed, not because anything was funny, but because I suddenly realized she had absolutely no idea what consequences really looked like. After hanging up, I walked into my grandfather's old workshop, opened a steel filing cabinet that hadn't moved in decades, and pulled out a weathered tube filled with original land surveys, utility drawings, handwritten notes, and one document that changed everything. A document nobody in that neighborhood even knew existed. If you want to see what happened next, that document wasn't some secret government file or buried treasure map. It was something far less exciting to look at and infinitely more valuable in court. An original utility easement package from 1963, complete with engineering drawings, county approvals, receipts for pipe deliveries, and handwritten notes from my grandfather explaining exactly why he paid to install a private natural gas pipeline across his own land. Back then, there wasn't a subdivision here, just scattered farms and a handful of homes that couldn't afford individual utility construction. Grandpa figured if everyone pitched in labor, he covered the material costs because neighbors helped neighbors. He never imagined that 60 years later those farms would become luxury homes selling for over $1 million each. I spent the rest of that afternoon sitting in my attorney Melissa Grant's office while she flipped through every page with the kind of expression lawyers get when they realize a case is about to become very interesting. She didn't say much for nearly half an hour. She just kept highlighting sections, comparing survey numbers with current county records, occasionally smiling to herself. Finally, she leaned back and asked, "Has anyone ever approached your family about purchasing this pipeline?" I told her no. "Has anyone ever signed a maintenance agreement?" No again. "Has anyone paid for inspections, insurance, repairs, or lease rights?" I shook my head. Melissa looked at me over the top of her glasses and quietly said, "Ethan, unless the county somehow missed something extraordinary, your family still owns every inch of this infrastructure." I wasn't celebrating. I actually felt uncomfortable because 42 families depended on that line. Most of them had never done anything to me personally. They were just people living their lives. Melissa seemed to read exactly what I was thinking. She said, "This isn't about punishing innocent people. This is about reminding an organization that property rights don't disappear because someone forms an HOA." For 2 more days, we researched everything: county records, utility filings, easement transfers, corporate registrations. Nothing. The subdivision developers had connected every house to my family's private pipeline decades after it was built, assuming ownership had somehow transferred along the way. It never had. Legally speaking, they had been using private infrastructure without any written agreement for years. Melissa drafted a professional lease package instead of a threat. It wasn't outrageous either. $340 per month per household during heating season, mandatory insurance contributions, reimbursement for my plumbing damage, permanent recognition of maintenance access across my property, and one additional condition that mattered more than the money. The HOA would permanently acknowledge that my property existed outside its jurisdiction. If they sign, she told me, everyone wins. They'll finally have legal access to the gas system, and you'll finally have legal protection from this nonsense. I mailed 42 certified envelopes that Friday afternoon. Every homeowner received exactly the same paperwork. Sharon received an extra letter explaining that the main supply valve would be temporarily closed 72 hours after delivery unless agreements were executed. We also notified the gas utility and county offices, so there would be no confusion about what was happening. Everything was documented. Everything was legal. Monday morning arrived colder than the forecast predicted. I drove my truck to the concrete utility vault, sitting behind my grandfather's old machine shed. I'd walked past it thousands of times growing up without appreciating what it represented. The steel cover groaned as I opened it. Below sat the original valve assembly, freshly inspected just 2 years earlier because I'd always maintained what belonged to my family. I rested one hand on the wheel for several seconds. Honestly, I hoped someone would call before I had to turn it. Nobody did. I slowly closed the valve, locked the vault, climbed back into my truck, and drove away feeling far less victorious than people later assumed. Around lunchtime, my phone started buzzing. First one unknown number, then another, then another. Most were confused homeowners asking whether I'd received the same strange letters they had. A few thought it had to be some elaborate scam. I politely explained the situation and encouraged them to speak with their attorney. Then Sharon called. She didn't sound confident anymore. She sounded furious. "You cannot interrupt utility service," she shouted before I even finished saying hello. "Actually," I replied, "I didn't interrupt utility service. I temporarily suspended access to privately owned infrastructure after 60 years of free use." Silence. Then she laughed. "Nobody is going to believe that." I answered, "The county recorder already does." She hung up. By evening, the neighborhood Facebook group had turned into complete chaos. Someone posted that every furnace had stopped receiving gas. Another family uploaded photos of portable heaters lining their living room. One man insisted I'd committed a federal crime. Someone else replied with screenshots from county records confirming the pipeline belonged to Parcel 17B, my property. Suddenly, the conversation shifted from attacking me to demanding answers from the HOA board. Tuesday morning, temperatures dropped below -8. Hardware stores across town sold out of electric heaters before lunch. I drove to a supply warehouse for work and saw 3 of my neighbors loading generators into pickup trucks. One of them, a guy named Daniel, waved me over. We barely spoken before. He looked exhausted. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I didn't know any of this. My wife thought those letters from Sharon meant your RV violated neighborhood rules. We never realized you weren't even in the HOA." I believed him. Most residents had simply trusted whatever the board told them. I explained that my issue wasn't with families trying to stay warm. It was with people who believed they could damage someone else's property without consequences. Daniel nodded slowly and admitted something that surprised me. "Sharon told us if we kept pressuring you long enough, you'd eventually sell." That sentence stayed with me the rest of the day because suddenly every warning letter, every complaint, every inspection request started making sense. They never cared about the RV. They cared about the land. My 40 acres divided their subdivision into 2 sections. If they could pressure me into leaving, developers could buy the property and connect both halves into one enormous expansion. The RV had simply been the excuse. That realization changed everything inside me. This wasn't neighborhood etiquette. It wasn't aesthetics. It was strategy. Later that afternoon, emergency vehicles entered the subdivision. An elderly couple had experienced a carbon monoxide alarm after running an improperly ventilated backup heater. Thankfully, everyone was okay, but the fire marshal began asking routine questions about gas service interruptions and utility permits. By then, county officials were reviewing documents we had already submitted. The HOA couldn't explain who actually owned the pipeline because they'd never bothered to verify it themselves. Wednesday evening, the board called an emergency meeting inside the clubhouse. I didn't attend, but several homeowners recorded portions of it on their phones. People weren't yelling at me anymore. They were yelling at Sharon. One homeowner demanded to know why dues had increased every year while basic infrastructure ownership had never been confirmed. Another asked whether the HOA carried liability insurance for utility systems. They didn't. 3 board members resigned before the meeting ended. One simply stood up, placed his folder on the table, apologized to everyone in the room, and walked out without looking back. Around the same time, another family discovered their insurance claim for frozen plumbing had been denied because the loss stemmed from an unresolved private utility dispute rather than a covered equipment failure. The financial panic spread faster than the cold itself. Local television stations started calling Thursday morning after county filings became public record. A reporter asked if I considered myself the villain. I told her, if someone parks in your driveway for 60 years without asking, eventually they're going to have to knock on your door. That clip aired during the 6 o'clock news. At exactly 8:13 that night, my phone rang again. Sharon's voice sounded completely different this time. Quieter, slower, almost careful. She asked if we could finally have a reasonable conversation. I looked out the RV window as snow drifted across the property my grandfather had worked his whole life to protect. Then I told her I was ready to talk, but only if everyone was finally prepared to listen. If you want the conclusion, I told Sharon there wasn't going to be any backroom deal. No handshake over coffee, no special treatment because she'd suddenly discovered the meaning of compromise. If she wanted the gas flowing again, every homeowner would receive exactly the same opportunity under exactly the same terms. She sighed for a long moment before asking, "What does it take to end this?" I answered without raising my voice because by then I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply finished being pushed around. The lease stays exactly as written. Every homeowner signs it. The HOA reimburses the full cost of the plumbing damage caused when my power was cut. The association permanently removes every restriction aimed at my property. And one more thing, she interrupted, already irritated. There's always one more thing. I smiled even though she couldn't see me. From now on, if the board wants to discuss anything involving my land, I get a permanent advisory seat with full access to every meeting related to neighboring property issues. Not because I want power, because I don't intend to let this happen again. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked how much time they had. I looked at the weather forecast on my phone. Midnight temperatures were expected to fall below -15 again. 6 hours, I said. After that, the offer changes. She knew exactly what I meant. Every hour without heat meant more frozen pipes, more hotel bills, more insurance claims, more homeowners demanding answers from the very people who had created this disaster. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than any official announcement. Homeowners who had barely spoken to me before began calling, not to argue, but to apologize. Some admitted they'd believed every story the HOA told about me. Others confessed they'd signed complaints against my RV simply because they assumed everyone else had done the same. One retired schoolteacher drove to my gate carrying homemade soup in a thermos. She looked embarrassed as she handed it to me and quietly said, "I should have asked questions instead of believing rumors." That apology meant more than the money ever would. Around 10:30 that night, Melissa called to tell me signed agreements were arriving at her office almost faster than her staff could process them. Families weren't fighting the contracts anymore because they finally understood something Sharon never had. Ownership matters. You can't vote your way around someone else's property rights just because they're inconvenient. At 11:47, my phone buzzed one last time. Melissa laughed before she even spoke. 42 signatures. Certified funds have cleared. The reimbursement check is here. The amended HOA bylaws have been filed electronically with the county. Congratulations. This is officially over. I sat quietly for another minute, listening to nothing but the wind outside the RV. I thought I'd feel triumphant, maybe even vindicated, but mostly I felt tired. My grandfather used to say winning isn't always loud. Sometimes it sounds like silence after people finally stop arguing. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my heavy coat, and walked through knee-deep snow toward the old concrete vault one last time. The stars were unbelievably bright against the frozen sky. Everything around me was still. I unlocked the steel cover, climbed down carefully, wrapped both hands around the valve wheel, and slowly turned it open. There wasn't some dramatic explosion of sound, no cheering crowd, no cinematic music, just the quiet mechanical vibration of gas beginning to move through a pipeline built by a farmer who believed helping his neighbors was simply the right thing to do. Within minutes, furnace igniters began clicking to life across the subdivision. One by one, warm air returned to 42 homes. Lights came on behind frosted windows. Thin trails of steam rose from rooftop vents into the freezing night. As I walked back toward my RV, I noticed a dark SUV rolling slowly down the road. Sharon sat behind the wheel. She looked over for a second. Neither of us waved. Neither of us smiled. There wasn't anything left to say. Some lessons cost more than money. The following weeks brought changes nobody expected. The HOA elected an entirely new board made up of homeowners instead of self-appointed neighborhood politicians. Every infrastructure agreement was professionally audited. Independent attorneys reviewed governing documents before new rules were adopted. Several residents later invited me to community cookouts, and for the first time since moving there, I actually felt like I had neighbors instead of opponents. I accepted a few invitations. I declined others. Life slowly became normal again. My cabin is finally standing where the old RV used to be. And every time I look out across those 40 acres, I think less about the conflict and more about my grandfather's decision all those years ago. He built that pipeline to help people, not to control them. The difference is that he never forgot it belonged to him, and neither did I. Looking back, I don't think the coldest part of that winter was the weather. It was watching a handful of people convince themselves that power gave them ownership, that rules outweighed rights, and that intimidation would always work, until one piece of forgotten history reminded everyone that respect cannot be enforced through threats. Now I'd love to hear what you think. Was I justified in shutting off access to property my family legally owned after every peaceful option had failed? Or should I have found another way even after they damaged my home? Let me know where you stand in the comments, because stories like this always divide people. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, difficult neighbors, or someone who confused authority with ownership, share your experience too. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because there are plenty more real-world conflicts where patience, persistence, and knowing your rights changed everything.